Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with veteran jazz organist Mitch Towne. He opened up at length about his new 2023 CD SRT, Vanguards of Groove. On SRT's debut album, it is the work of three seasoned and accomplished pros who are still hungry. It's an all-instrumental outing, as tight, funky, and thunderously rocking as it is warm and nuanced. Featuring the legendary John J.R. Robinson, known as the most recorded drummer of all time, working with legends like Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston and Madonna, along with many more. We get into this project, Mitch's life, and so much more. Enjoy the interview.
Hey, man. Hey, it's great to meet you. Thank you for taking a minute out to the program. I appreciate it.
Oh, you bet. Glad to do it.
Before we get into SRT, Vanguards of Groove, I want to know, we all lived through quite a thing with COVID for the last 3 years, and I'm wondering how you survived. How did you survive it, and how has it changed the way that you do things now?
Well, it's funny you're asking that, especially because I can't talk about that without talking about SRT, because it was because of pandemic that this band got formed, basically. A couple years before that, around 2018, I had met J.R. Robinson because he had come to Omaha to perform a concert with David Foster, because J.R. tours with David. And I just happened to meet him. It wasn't like, anything I set out to do. I didn't even know J.R. was on that show when I went, but he was there, and I had an opportunity to speak to him. And we're both from Iowa, so we sort of bonded over that. And J.R. is just a great guy. He's just really nice, And we talked maybe for 5 minutes. And he gave me his business card. And I really don't know why. I think he was just being nice, because why would, what reason would I have to ever call the most recorded drummer of all time, living in Omaha, and he's in L.A., But I thought it was really cool. I had J.R. Robinson's business card, and I used it as a bookmark for the next couple of years. So whenever I'd read a book, I'm like, hey, J.R. Robinson's card. So there's a great jazz club in Omaha called The Jewel. And in 2019, The Jewel opened up, and I was doing a lot of shows there, and the management had sort of partnered with me to bring in some great artists, so I kind of spent a lot of 2019 playing with some really great musicians based in other parts of the U.S., especially New York City, people like Joel Fromm and Jerry Bergonzi and Matt Wilson and Dan Wilson and Troy Roberts, some of the real greats in the business. And so things were going really well with that, and then, of course, the pandemic hit, and everything shuts down, and my career grinds to a halt, as everyone's did. So during the pandemic, I knew this about myself, but it really became apparent because as the pandemic started, I was just like everybody else. I was like, now I'm going to have time to really work on some stuff, and, I can now, instead of practicing a bunch of music for upcoming gigs, I can really work on some things I wanted to get in my playing and all that. None of that happened. I think everybody thought, I'm going to write the novel I've always wanted to write or do that kind of thing. No, I didn't practice near as much as I thought I was going to because, like everybody, I was depressed. I think a lot of people dealt with this depression and this, not knowing what was coming next. And there were times when I was like, is my career over? Is this it? Did I reach this certain level and then that's the end, right? And I know that that's what, everybody was dealing with, that nobody knew what was going to happen. So as the months of pandemic wore on, what I realized about myself as a musician is that I need things to look forward to. I'm driven by the opportunity to play with other musicians. I am not a solo artist. I get very excited when I have an upcoming gig with somebody and they send me the music to learn for it. And I love to prepare. I love to look forward to things. And of course, with pandemic, I had nothing to look forward to. So around about September of that year, I watched the Quincy Jones documentary on Netflix. And JR is in it because JR was Quincy's go-to guy for the longest time. He plays on all the Michael Jackson stuff, Quincy solo records, The Dude, things like that. JR's the drummer on Off the Wall and on most of the songs on Bad, you know. And so JR's in that documentary talking about Quincy. And I'm like, oh, wow, cool, there's JR. You know, I've got his business card. Couple weeks later, I watched the David Foster documentary that was on Netflix. JR's in that. And something about that just sort of, you know, clicked in my brain a little bit. And I started thinking that, okay, ideally, the world is going to open up again. And I need to have something to look forward to. I need to have something, at least a possibility in the works, right? Maybe it wouldn't come together, but maybe something could. So I came up with this idea that since JR is from Iowa, he's from about an hour and a half from Omaha, a town called Creston. And I'm from Iowa, a little town right outside of Omaha called Missouri Valley. And I thought, okay, maybe JR still has some family back here. Maybe he'd come to the area. What if I put together a show at the Jewel, a tribute to J.R. Robinson, featuring J.R. Robinson? And we do a bunch of the hits that he was the drummer on, that he helped make famous, you know. And, you know, Omaha has a really great group of musicians, and I knew I could put together a killer band to execute these songs. And I thought to myself, you know, what's the worst he can say? The worst he can say is no, or he never gets back to me. You know, I had to take a shot at this. You know, I felt like, you know, with everything with the pandemic and also just, you know, feeling like, you know, we're all getting older. It's like you can't wait for breaks. You sometimes have to make them yourself, or at least try. So I wrote up an email, and I wrote up an email pitch, and I said, I'm sure you don't remember meeting me, but, you know, I met you in Omaha. Believe it or not, I can put together a crack band here in Omaha to pull off these songs. I want to do a tribute to you. I've got a singer who can sing Whitney and Chaka Khan, you know, and I think this would be a really cool thing. Let me know if you're interested. And he eventually got back to me, you know, and I always joke that he got back to me with the shortest email ever. He's like, I like this idea. We have to wait for a vaccine. Hit me up in 4 months. And I was like, will do, you know. So about 4 months later, you know, I reached out once the vaccine started to roll out, and we spent most of 2021 kind of talking about it and kind of planning it, trying to figure out when to do it. And we eventually did that show in December of 2021 at the Jewel. We packed the place. Every musician that I hired knocked it out of the park. I mean, I was so proud of everybody, and it just went off so well. The funny thing about, you know, when I told him, I thought, I have a singer who can sing Whitney and Chaka. That was the one thing where he was like, really? I was like, trust me. And this girl named Allison Nash, who now lives in Florida, but she lived here at the time. She's one of the greatest singers I've ever played with. And she just knocked it out of the park. I mean, you know, when she did I Will Always Love You, the crowd was literally in tears. You know, I mean, it was a really fabulous night. One of the best shows of my career. And JR was really happy, and he wanted to take that band on the road. He wanted to go do this in other places. Well, that's a 6-piece group, and that's kind of pricey. You know, it's hard to take a 6-piece out and make any money. It's an expensive proposition. So in the meantime, you know, he and I had become friends, pretty good, pretty close. We texted each other a lot, and one day I just said, hey, did you ever think about you ever want to record an organ trio? And he said, yeah, I've thought about it. And I texted him back, well, I know an organ player. And he wrote back, I know a drummer. And so that was the first seed of what became SRT. And so, of course, the next thing was if it's going to be a trio, we have to find a third. So we started talking about guitar players, and JR said, I've got the guy. He's this younger player who is the top session call guy in LA right now. His name is Andrew Sinowick, and he and Andrew had just done a session. They did a new version of the song Staying Alive by the Bee Gees for the Bullet Train soundtrack, the movie with Brad Pitt that came out last year. And that's the lead song on it. That's the song that's in the trailer. It's JR and Andrew playing Staying Alive with the lyrics in Japanese. And so he's like, I think this is the guy, we need to approach him. I'm like, great. You know, we approached Andrew and he was into it. And so we just started writing songs this is in 2022. We started writing songs for 2 or 3 months. And then in July of 2022, we went into LAFX recording studio out in LA, and we recorded the record the old-fashioned way, just 3 guys in a studio, and recorded it in 2 days.
Wow, that's an amazing backstory. What a wonderful, wonderful story. What are you hoping the listener gets from this album?
I hope they enjoy it. I think, we didn't make a traditional, because, we didn't make a traditional organ trio record. There's not a lot of, there's like one straight ahead swing tune on it, but it's not a lot of, what we call splang-a-dang. It's a wide variety, man. We all 3 of us are coming from different angles musically, but yet similar angles. So there's some funky things on it. There's one tune, like the lead tune off the record is called Tal Shaya, and that's an absolute shredder. It's totally different than anything I've ever done in an organ trio setting. It's what I consider a rock shredder. But like I said, there's some funky things on it. There's a couple ballads. Andrew wrote this beautiful ballad named Long Road, which is it's just one of the nicest pieces of music I've ever played. And that's a big feature of all of our live shows. We always play Long Road because it's just so great. I tell you, I can't say enough about Andrew. He is, to be a session player, you have to be extremely versatile. And Andrew can play any style, authentically. He's not just faking it. Like when we do a funk tune, he sounds like the Meters, and when we do a straight ahead tune, he sounds like Wes, and when we do a shredding tune, he just shreds naturally. He's one of those guys that can just do anything, but he's got his own personality in his playing too. So that's it's just, and of course, JR is JR Robinson. That guy. What's great about this group for him, I think, is that, JR is known as he's the clock, man. If you listen to his playing on any of those, songs that he made famous, Rock With You and, Higher Love by Steve Winwood and All Night Long by Lionel Richie. Everything is just locked in so solid. His groove is just impeccable. And, he's being a session drummer. He's just laying it down. But JR has tons of chops that he doesn't always get to utilize. So this is a great band for him to get to stretch out. And, he's a well-known drummer, but man, people come out and they're like, whoa, I didn't know you did that thing. He's got all these chops. So it's really a fantastic way for him to get to stretch. Like I said, stylistically, it's kind of all around. So I think there's something on the record for most listeners.
So how did this journey begin for you? How did you get into the jazz?
I think like most people who end up playing organ, I started off as a piano player. I grew up in a small town in Iowa, which, of about, 3,500, 4,000 people, my graduating class had like 88 people in it. So it was a small school, but, surprisingly, there was a real current of music that went through that town in the form of like older kids. So like when I was like in junior high, there were some like really good high school players, and they were into pretty more advanced stuff, so it's like I got exposed to things like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I'll tell you what really turned the tide for me was when I was a freshman in high school and somebody played me Tower of Power. And I remember it like it was yesterday, hearing Squib Cakes for the first time, and I was like, what is that? I didn't know who Charlie Parker was till I got to college, and that's back in the day when, if you didn't know if somebody didn't tell you, you didn't know. If someone didn't tell you John Coltrane existed, you didn't know John Coltrane existed. There was no way for you to be exposed to it. Maybe there was a local radio station in Omaha that played jazz. But, back in that day, they were playing a lot of fusion and that kind of stuff, So I didn't hear real jazz till I got to college. But I was into music that was a little more advanced and challenging, when I was in high school. So then when I went to college, I went to the University of Iowa, which has a very good jazz school. It did back then, and it really does now. It's an excellent school for music. I learned very quickly that I didn't know anything. I had no idea how to read a lead sheet. I didn't know. I really got my young butt handed to me at the first jazz band audition because I realized, okay, I don't know a thing about this, but I really dived into it. And I was a piano player, of course. I didn't know a thing about the organ back then because back then the organ was very out. It was not, it was not an instrument that was at all in vogue. The only time I ever really heard a Hammond organ was either listening to classic rock or seeing Paul Schaefer on the David Letterman show, play Hammond all the time. But I loved that sound. But I knew nothing about it, and I was concentrating on piano. So, of course, I got into Bill Evans and Herbie and McCoy, all the usual suspects and Chick and everything like that, and really studied jazz piano and got to a certain level of proficiency. But I always loved the organ. And sometime in my 20s, I finally bought a B3. And I had to set about, because at that time, you got to remember, early mid 90s, Joey DeFrancesco came along. And Joey DeFrancesco really brought the organ back. I don't think there's too many players of any instrument where you can say that they made their instrument relevant again. But Joey D came along and showed everybody, reminded everybody how great the Hammond organ was, and also showed what it's capable of, because Joey was taking things to a totally different level. And so there's a lot of people like myself who heard him early on and thought, okay, I like that direction. I like that sound. How do I figure that out? And so, like I said, I bought a B3, and this is back in the days of AOL chat boards and stuff, So once that stuff came along, because the Hammond organ used to be sort of a dark art. If you didn't have somebody even show you how to turn the thing on, you couldn't even turn it on. It isn't even simple to turn the thing on, let alone set the drawbars, get the settings, figure out how to run everything. If you didn't know someone who played organ, you weren't going to play organ, unless you grew up in a church and somebody showed you, or you knew a guy who could tell you stuff. Well, fortunately, with, when the internet came along, this kind of information started to become a little more out in the open. And I got hooked up. I was befriended by a guy online named Sal Azzarelli, who was an amazing guru of the organ. He was a player. He was a good player, but he didn't play as much as he was a tech, and he was a historian. And Sal was one of those guys that could take a Hammond organ, apart down to the wires and rebuild it. He was one of those guys. Talk about finding a resource. It was just an absolute blessing to become friends with Sal, and he sort of took me under his wing. And I always tell this story about, because in this trio, in a Hammond organ trio, there is no bass player. I'm doing everything with my left hand and my foot. So that's kind of what makes SRT different than a lot of other bands, is there's no bass player. And, but that's the tradition in a Hammond organ trio. But since we're doing a lot of different kind of more funky rock stuff, it is a little different. I think it's a little special. And but back then, I had no idea. I was a piano player. I comped with my left hand. I didn't play stride. I didn't play a lot of bass lines because that's the bass player's job in the jazz trio or in the jazz quartet, right? I was told, stay out of that area. Anything below the S in Steinway belongs to the bass player, So I remember saying to Sal, I was like, Sal, Sal was Joey DeFrancesco's organ tech, so he and Joey were very close. So I was getting information, almost, directly from the source, And I said, Sal, how do I even start to play bass lines like Joey does? I don't have any idea how to do that. I comp with my left hand. I don't know how to play bass. And the best advice I ever got from Sal was he goes, okay, I want you to take your right hand and sit on it for 6 weeks and don't touch the organ with your right hand. And with your left hand, I want you to learn to walk an F jazz blues bass line. Don't try to solo. Don't try to comp chords. Just walk an F blues for 6 weeks. And at the end of 6 weeks, I want you to be able to walk an F blues bass line and tell me a joke at the same time. And so that's what I did. And it worked. What he was teaching me was that was your left hand has to really be able to kind of go on autopilot. I'm not playing the same patterns over and over. At first I was. At first I figured out one pattern to get through a blues, But now it's not like that. But what he was teaching me was that you have to have some left-hand independence, because the joke that you're telling at the same time, that's your solo. That's your comping. That's everything you're doing with your right hand is that joke. So I need to be able to have my left hand going on its own while I was able to freely think and talk or solo with another part of my brain. So that was what started the journey. So after that, once I was able to do that, I just opened the real book and started working through standards. Just, page after page, Stella by Starlight, and Turn Out the Stars, and, Have You Met Miss Jones, and just going through all the standards and learning how to do that, learning how to not rely on a bass player and to make the bass player be me.
So out of all of these roads that you've been down and everything that you've done, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, and fans, but ultimately you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Wow. It took a long time to get to the point where just now, really, in just the last few years, and I'll play something. I'll be very honest with you. What really helped me in the last 5 or 6 years is I started to see a therapist. Because one thing that musicians deal with, I think almost universally, is that we are very self-critical. We are our own worst critics, and nobody thinks we sound as bad as we think we sound. And so seeing a therapist helped me work through some of that and to realize that I was not seeing myself or my playing or hearing myself in a fair way, and so that really helped me to start to realize, okay, I do have my own voice. It's sometimes hard to find, because you're walking in the footsteps of giants. You're trying to sound like Joey D or Jimmy Smith, or if you play piano, McCoy, Herbie Chick. I mean, there's just a whole lineage of amazing musicians. But it's taking all of those things and filtering them through your own personality and your own playing that eventually you come out. So I really feel like getting into this trio has kind of been one of the final pieces of the puzzle to be like, okay, this is who I am. I'm able to play a variety of styles on the Hammond organ. I can swing straight ahead. I can do standards. I can do modern jazz. I've played with some amazing cats who write, really modern stuff. And I'm able to do that, but I'm also able to do this funky thing with SRT. It's like I'm really starting to just find my lane and feel like, there's always players that I look up to and think, oh, I'll never be as great as this guy, or, but I feel like I can that I can sit at the table, that I've got something to say, that I can play. And that's something maybe I couldn't have said to you 5 years ago or 6 years ago before I started seeing a therapist. I'd have been like, oh no, So there's really something to be said for that kind of, that kind of self introspection that is led by someone who can help you walk through stuff. I don't know if that's an answer to your question or not, but
Yeah. No, that's a good answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense, and that delves in a little deeper than what I was looking at. No, that's great. I'm curious, where's the best place for anybody to find out about picking this album up in the right place and anything live shows, anything related to you?
Well, the album will come out on September 8th, so it'll be released nationwide and all that. It's already out in Japan. We partnered with a record label called P-Vine in Japan, and they put the record out in June, right before we did a week tour of Japan. SRT went over and did the Billboard Live clubs in Osaka, Yokohama, and Tokyo. And this is a really cool thing. They still have Tower Records over in Japan. We don't have those here anymore, but those used to be, the mecca of finding records back in the day. But they still have Tower Records over in Japan, and they had a huge display of SRT in the Tower Records over there. So the three of us went out there and got our pictures taken with the display. So that was kind of cool. But the record comes out on September 8th. You can find information about SRT at srtgroove.com.
Cool.
So that's where you'll find information about us. We have an SRT page up on YouTube. We're of course on Instagram and Facebook, so you can find out stuff about us on the usual avenues.
Cool. Mitch, this has been great. Thank you so much for opening up.
You bet, man. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening and tuning into another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players and minds in LA, New York City, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Mitch for his time, energy, and cool. If you want to hear more interviews, you can find Neon Jazz interviews on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to us at YouTube, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to theneonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.